So good evening, everyone. I'm Ashley Koning, Assistant Research Professor and Director of the Eagleton Center for Public Interest Polling here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. Our center, which is home to the Rutgers-Eagleton poll, has quite a legacy in the world of statewide polling. It was established in 1971, and now we are celebrating over 50 years. It is the first and longest continuously running university-based statewide public polling operation in the United States. That's a mouthful. The event is also co-sponsored by the Association of Academic Survey Research Organizations, a leading voice in support and promotion of excellence in survey research conducted in academic settings, the Rutgers-Camden Alumni Association, and the Women's Pre-Law Society, serving women at Rutgers who are pre-law students by providing aid in the transition to the legal field. We are incredibly fortunate to have an incredible panel here tonight, especially during the busiest points of the season, 5 weeks out from Election Day. The following program will be a 45-minute discussion about pre-election polling, followed by a 15-minute Q&A to close. Please remember, if you'd like to submit a question, please use the chat box in order to do so. Our first panelist tonight, Natalie Jackson, who you do not see on the screen, unfortunately had a last-minute work conflict, being the campaign pollster now that she is. This is something, obviously, that is not uncommon for pollsters weeks before Election Day. Natalie was kind enough to send us a pre-recorded video to share her expertise on polling, forecasting, campaign polling, and all things related to pre-election polling. Dr. Natalie Jackson is the Vice President at GQR and former Huffington Post poll forecast director. Natalie has spent nearly 2 decades developing extensive expertise in survey research, methodology, and political polling. Her research on how people form opinions, as well as on the election polling and forecasting landscape, has appeared in peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes, and she has a weekly column on data politics called Leading Indicators at the National Journal. I'm going to play a video now of Natalie. As we've said a million times since 2020, I'm going to share my screen.
Hi, I'm Natalie Jackson, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person tonight. I got scheduled into some focus groups and was unable to find coverage because, we are 40 days away from the election, which is what you're all here to hear about tonight. I'm going to talk quickly about 2 things. One is using polls in aggregates and forecasts. The other is my work as a private pollster, since I've gone over to the dark side now. That's a joke. So first off, aggregation and forecasting. These are relatively new tools. They've been around since the early 2000s, late 2000s. So I guess it has been a while now. But these things came about as a result of having too many polls. We suddenly started getting a lot more polls as the internet expanded and more pollsters had access to data. The quality of that data is a question that I'm sure others on the panel will talk about, so I'll leave that alone. But the idea behind a polling aggregate was that there are a lot of polls, and how can someone who doesn't know much about polling get an idea of where things stand without, having to dive into methodologies, dive into crosstabs. And, it was very much a user-friendly type of product in its origins. It's still a nice tool. There are probably too many of them out there now. They all sort of say the same thing. You do have to be careful because they make a lot of assumptions. Some of them weight polls differently. So there are a lot of quirks to these at this point. But what the big picture is, they should not and cannot be substituted for good, high quality survey work. There's an attitude that's pervasive now of just throw it in the average. Anytime a poll differs from what people expect, just throw it in the average. And I really dislike that, even as someone who has run aggregates and thinks they are fundamentally a useful tool. I think the idea of just throw every poll in the aggregate is dismissive of the work that goes into polling, the work that goes into high quality polling, And it also incentivizes people to put out junk because it's just going to get rolled into the average. So I would like to see that attitude go away. But as far as aggregates themselves, they can be a useful tool for people. Forecasts are also an interesting tool. The statistical questions behind a forecast are very interesting. You have even more assumptions that go into a forecast model. Every person building a forecast model that requires thousands and thousands of lines of code, they're making decisions. They're making tons of decisions. And you may not always know what those are. So you're adopting that person's decisions when you look at it. And part of those decisions focus on how to deal with uncertainty. Uncertainty is always a problem when you're working with a probability-based forecast. You're not sure where or how much certainty to put in, how much extra. The bottom line is that polls will always have a baseline of uncertainty, but if the polls are always pointing in one direction, that's going to be hard to create enough uncertainty in your model not to cause it to go, too far toward one outcome. So the incentive is, of course, to make it closer to 50-50, more of a toss-up level. I think we do see a lot of that right now. We have very close races, and so the forecasts really aren't telling us that much, at least not any more than polls do, which is that it's a close race, and really it could go any direction at this point. So with that said, I'll turn to private polls. So I am now doing client-side private polling. It's a very different purpose than what you see put out in public. We look at horse race, of course, we're tracking horse race, but it's not the star. We need to know where the candidate stands that we're working for, but really what we're looking for is message development. Often we've had focus groups and we're taking what we learned in the focus group and moving it into a survey. And we're looking to make strategic decisions, what topics, what issues need to go in ads, who needs to be targeted with those ads, even when to change things up and what messages are breaking through and which ones are not. So they're a really integral part of the campaign or the PAC work. And it's just a very different style of using the data to make concrete decisions that I find very enjoyable. In addition to campaign work, we also do issue work. We do corporate reputation and branding work. Not all of the work at GQR is political. That's true of every private side firm. And so it's a lot of interesting work where we're applying it directly to decision making. So that's a big difference that I noticed between what you get in a public poll, which is meant to inform, and what we produce in a private poll, which is meant to make decisions. So I will wrap up there and let the rest of the panel take over. Again, I apologize that I'm not there, and thank you for your attention.
We certainly miss Natalie tonight, but she had incredibly insightful things to say about forecasting and aggregation, as well as kind of how campaign polling differs on the internal side from the rest of what we'll be talking about tonight. We are so grateful to have the rest of our panelists here with us live. I want to first turn to Dr. Don Levy, Director of Siena College Research Institute, also my mentor and the whole reason why I'm here in polling in the first place. Don has led massive pre-election polling efforts in battleground states and nationally throughout the last decade, and has completed numerous polling projects in partnership with major media partners, most notably the New York Times Upshot. Under Don's leadership, the New York Times Siena poll has been ranked the most accurate pollster in America by 538.com. Don, talk to us about the New York Times Siena poll. Everyone has been buzzing about the bout of polls that you guys have come out with in the past week or so. So why don't you give us a glimpse into the process and what all of you have been finding?
Okay, hey, thank you very much, Ashley. Appreciate being with you and the other members of the panel. We are a telephone shop. What we seek to do is to develop a sample that is representative of a universe that doesn't exist yet. So although we have, all of us think we know who's going to vote in the upcoming election, that is the universe that we're trying to generalize to. Just this evening, the New York Times Siena poll is making it in the neighborhood of 50 to 60,000 phone calls across 4 different states just tonight. Now, polling, and maybe some of the other members of the panel will have time to explain. Sometimes those of us in the business refer to it at this point as the wild, wild west. There are any number of different methodological approaches that very fine pollsters are taking. As I said, we are a telephone shop. We work off the list of registered voters, and we compute a probability that each of our potential respondents is going to vote. We then, when we get them on the phone, we'll ask them about that. We'll merge our computed probability with their stated probability into one score, and we end up applying that score as an iterative weight, just as we will weight by various demographics. That's different. Not everyone does that. Our view is that anyone who is registered to vote has a greater than 0 probability of being a voter. So in effect, everyone that we speak to is a likely voter. They're just likely to a different degree. We are quota and callback crazy at the New York Times Siena poll. So if we're calling a particular state, a battleground state, so for example, this evening, if you live in Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, or the second congressional district in the great state of Nebraska, you may be getting a phone call from us. We take any one of those geographies, we divide them up into a series of regions. Those regions we divide up into a series of demographic groups, and we have a quota for each and every one of those subgroups that we seek to fill. So we're using that technique very carefully, very methodically, to try to develop this representative sample of a group of people that will exist at some point in the future. And for those of you who are old school survey researchers, we, to the greatest degree that we can, are callback crazy. There had come a point where many pollsters would take extremely large samples, run through them as quickly as possible to seek to get whatever the end that they were looking for would be, 600, 1,000, 2,000. That's not our approach. We're a little bit more the way I was initially trained, where we have a relatively small sample, and we seek to call back people that are in our sample again and again and again. So even though we'll have 3 to 4 day field times, we will be calling people repeatedly in order to try to include them in our sample, in part, and we'll probably touch on this later, because of the threat of non-response bias that many of us suffered from in the 2020 election. So that's just a little bit about how we do what we do, and certainly happy to field any questions on that. Let me give a couple seconds that I have left on the race at this point. The race, I'll break it to you right now, it's close. We have been concentrating not only on national polls, and it's interesting that we have found our national polls very close. Some of our colleagues were out today with a couple of national polls that were in a point. So it could be, and it appears to us to be, a slightly different terrain than we have seen before. The rule of thumb had gotten to be that the Democrats needed to win by 4 to 5 in order to do well in the battleground. Now we're seeing some leads for Harris in the Rust Belt, Trump with some leads in the Sun Belt. But the national polling, at least in terms of many of the high quality polls, is now coming out about even. Who's going to decide this race? We see the race up for grabs in 7 battleground states amongst about 15% of voters. And our polling indicates that those voters tend to be somewhat younger. They tend to be a little bit less engaged. They tend to tell us that they are desperately concerned about the economy. But as a group, they're also concerned about reproductive rights. So they are an interesting group of voters that I think you'll hear more and more about. These people known as the persuadables. One other thing I'll just throw out, and then I've probably exceeded my time. Ashley, you can just wave at me if I'm talking too long. One thing that we found of late, 2 things actually. Number one is that the difference between the Senate races and the presidential, I think, are worthy of attention. We see in virtually every case where there's a major Senate race in a battleground state that the Democratic Senate candidate is overperforming relative to Vice President Harris's performance. So in other words, Trump is overperforming relative to the Senate or, of course, the gubernatorial candidate in North Carolina. That's a drama, that's a tendency that is worth continuing to look at. Other thing I'll raise, we are in New York. We poll the great state of New York on a regular basis. We have also found that New York, which went by 23 points to Joe Biden in 2020, is now tracking in our polls at about 13 points. No one thinks that New York is going to leave the blue column, but that difference where the traditional Democratic lead is cut about in half, I think is part of the drama that's playing out nationally in major blue states, may very well account for this dynamic that we're seeing, that the national polling is virtually tied, yet the battleground states are showing leads one way or the other. So I'll pause there and certainly hope to have a chance to explore some of these topics when we get to Q&A, and love to hear what Joe and Mark have to say.
Thank you so much, Don. Next, I'd like to turn to Dr. Mark Hugo Lopez, Director of Race and Ethnicity Research at the renowned Pew Research Center. Mark leads planning of the center's research agenda focused on chronicling the diverse, ever-changing racial and ethnic landscape of the United States. He's an expert on issues of racial and ethnic identity, Latino politics and culture, the U.S. Hispanic and Asian American populations, global and domestic immigration, and the U.S. demographic landscape. Mark, let's talk about crosstabs. What should we be aware of when it comes to crosstabs? That is the breakdown of the results by various key demographics that may affect individual voting behavior and issue stances. What patterns and trends have we seen take shape among key voting blocks, particularly when it comes to Black voters and Hispanic and Latino voters?
Well, let's start there with the Black voters and Latino voters, because that's where there's been a lot of interest. I'd say over the last couple of election cycles, as we've seen, for example, among Latino voters, Trump's been in the presidential race the last 3 times, and in those in 2016, Latino voters seem to have supported Trump at about 28% or so. In 2020, it was maybe about 36 to 38%. And what we're seeing in our most recent poll is Trump is doing about 39% among Latino registered voters today. That really does suggest that there has been somewhat of a shift from where we were, at least during the Obama years, when Latinos were supporting Obama anywhere between 71 to 80, almost 80%. And that has been a source of conversation. Some people might say concern, a lot of interest. And so you've seen various stories emerge about the nation's Latino voters. To get at your question about crosstabs, that one top line number about Latinos is great to know, and that's a very important number. But of course, it's a population that's diverse. Among the general population, about 1 in 5 Americans are now Latino. So it's a big population, and it's got a presence in just about every part of the country. And that's why we're talking about Latino voters, because they're important in many of the battleground states. But many of the stories that have emerged to try to explain this shift towards Trump in recent elections has really focused on a number of subgroups among Latinos. And this is where those crosstabs become important. And having surveys that are large enough for us to be able to tell those within group stories are key, if not important, because again, these are not monolithic groups. These are groups that have different points of view. We can't get to it all, but here are some examples. There's been a lot made about Hispanic men leaning towards Trump. And while it is the case that Hispanic men are more likely than Hispanic women to support Trump, it's really not that big of a difference, for example. And so our most recent polling among Latinos shows that among men, he's at about 41%, but among women, he's at about 37%. So that is interesting in and of itself, because Hispanic women as well have leaned more towards Donald Trump over the last few election cycles, as has been the case with men. So that can't explain it all. Another big story is Cubans. People oftentimes say, well, Cubans have long been the one strong Republican group among Latinos. And while that is true, although it has their support for presidential candidates, whether Democrat or Republican, have changed over time, one of the things that's important there is there's not enough Cuban voters in the country to explain some of the changes that we've seen in terms of where Latino voters are today and their levels of support for Harris or for Trump. And then there are other explanations that people offer. Third generation Latinos are perhaps more conservative. Mexican Americans in the Southwest are perhaps more conservative. And all of these stories are such important stories, but they're all part of the mosaic that makes up Latino voters. Among Black voters, very, very similar set of stories. And as you know, a lot of the conversation has been about Black men supporting Donald Trump. I think it's important, though, to note that among Black registered voters, Harris has 84%, according to our most recent poll, and Trump is at 13%. So while there is some support for Trump among Black voters, those numbers have generally been relatively low, and Democrats have done well among Black voters. But here, too, there are some important differences to note. Black men are more likely than Black women to say that they're going to support Trump, but not by a large margin. It's something that's important to take a look at. I would say other groups like Asian voters are important as well. And so when you're talking about all of this together, telling these within group stories is very important for understanding the nuances that explain the ways in which these groups vote and participate. One last thing I'd say that's important. We're getting close to the election. And of course, the big question is who's going to turn out to vote and how many are going to turn out to vote. Those Latino population numbers are huge, but Latinos also tend to be less likely to turn out to vote. So even in big turnout elections like 16 and 20, Latinos were still overrepresented among non-voters compared to voters, while Black voters were overrepresented among voters versus non-voters. So there's also some interesting patterns of engagement that one must be aware of. And so we'll see where things go, but understanding and paying attention to these various subgroups does help to paint a rich and nuanced story about any one group, whether that's Latinos, the general public, or Black Americans, or any other group.
Thank you so much, Mark. Lastly, I'd like to turn to Joe Lenski, co-founder and executive vice president of Edison Research. Under his supervision, Edison Research currently conducts all exit polls for the major news organizations comprising the National Election Pool, the NEP, ABC, CBS, CNN, and NBC. Edison Research has conducted all state and national exit polling for the NEP since 2003. So Joe, demystify the exit poll process for us. How are they done? What purpose do they serve? And what do they tell us?
Well, the unique part about exit polling is compared to the surveys that Don and Mark and Natalie are doing before election day to try to predict who's going to vote. Exit polls talk to voters after they voted. So we don't have to guess about likely models and who's going to vote and the probability of voters. We know a voter has voted because we talk to them after they leave the polling place on election day. Although voting has become more complicated in that only about half of voters now nationwide vote on election day, we've had to expand our definition of exit poll. And the exit poll is now a multi-mode survey. So in addition to talking to voters at hundreds of polling locations on election day after they voted, we are also talking to voters, interviewing them after they vote at early voting locations around the country in the weeks leading up to election day. And then we're doing a multi-mode survey of voters who vote by mail or vote early using telephone, cell phone, and landline telephone interviews, also using email interviewing, and also text to web interviewing. So we cast the net in a wide assortment of ways to gather all the potential voters off a voter registration list to account for the voters we can't talk to in person who vote on election day or early in person. The reason that's important is the change in not only how many people are voting early, but the partisan differences between voting methods based on how Donald Trump has made early voting and by mail voting questionable to his supporters. We now see Democrats much more likely to use by mail and early voting, and Republican voters much more likely to use election day voting. So using these multiple modes are necessary to capture the full electorate and make sure there aren't any partisan biases in who we're talking to. So on election day, when you're watching ABC or CBS or CNN or NBC or looking at the websites at the Washington Post or Reuters or BBC, you'll be seeing our surveys reported shortly before poll closing. And that's the voters that have actually voted on election day, or the voters we've contacted who have voted before election day. And that's our survey. And that's how we're going to know the answers to Mark's questions. You know, how are Blacks and Hispanics voting in this election? We'll find out the most important issues. We'll find out when these voters decided. We'll find out what they think of the candidates for president and vice president and how those affected their votes. And that's how we're going to get our picture of the electorate on election day.
Thank you so much, Joe. Okay, so let's get down to discussion. Who's going to win? I'm just kidding. I know that's a bad question to ask pollsters. We're not trying to, look into a crystal ball here, but let's talk about why pre-election polling and exit polls are important. Why are we still doing this with all of the challenges there are, and can we trust the polls that are out there?
Well, I'll take one quick stab at that, Ashley. Certainly, I think that, an underpinning of that question is the popular narrative that the polls are wrong. So there was a lot of issues with that in 2020. We will point out that in 2018 and in 2022, the pre-election polls were incredibly accurate. So it does appear as though there's a dynamic that takes place, at least in 16 and 20, that when Donald Trump is on the ballot, it has been a tougher terrain for pre-election pollsters. In fact, in 2020, if you looked at, as I think we did, as APORT did, about the last 50, 55 polls that were taken by high-quality pollsters leading up in the last couple of weeks before the election, virtually every single one of them overstated Biden's support relative to the final outcome. And I think the overall error was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 4 or 5 points. Our analysis of that pointed towards what we called an anti-establishment non-response bias. Rather than it just being a partisan non-response bias, non-response meaning that people are just less likely to speak to a pollster, whether that pollster is calling them on the phone, asking them to respond to a text, asking them to be online, whatever the case may be, every mode had error. What we found was in the areas that voted most heavily for Donald Trump, that's where the error tended to take place. So what are we doing about that so that we can be trusted as being accurate in this cycle? We've done a couple of things. One thing, we went back through our data and found that a lot of people that we speak to on the phone only partially complete the survey. In fact, it was not uncommon for someone to pick up the phone, to yell Trump, and then hang up. So what we did is we've moved our horse race question, the pre-election question, up to the top. We follow that by some key demographics. And if someone makes it through that part of the survey, that's about the first minute. They now count, and we do a dual weighting system, but we count those partials. Had we done that in 2020, it would have erased about 1.5 points of at least our error. So that's one of the things we did. The other thing that we did is a little bit down in the weeds, and it has to do with how we stratify our sample and how we model our sample in areas that are most prone to error, to have a greater density of likely non-responders in the sample to up our odds. Because, as I think anybody can realize, even if you call an area that, let's say, when Joe did his exit poll in 2020, he found that the results were, say, 75-25 Trump to Biden. Our poll had it at 65-35. And so we're trying to guard against that with those two techniques, one being including partials, the other being in a more aggressive stratification of the sample that we're working from. And I think everyone who suffered that ignominy of that error in 2020 is taking whatever steps they can to have this representative sample that includes folks who in some cases are just simply less likely, less inclined to participate in public opinion research. I think we're accurate. I think that we had a great year in 2022. And certainly, I think that the American public can rest assured that we are doing the finest work that we can to find that representative sample and give an accurate reading of that sample.
Thanks, Don. Just to interject, if you could put your questions, anyone who has questions, please use the Q&A box as our chat box. The regular chat box is not going to function, so please use the Q&A box. Any other comments, Joe, Mark, on that particular question?
Yeah, I was going to say that one of the things about pre-election polling that is also important is to not only understand which candidates voters might vote for, but understanding the issues that are of importance. And as events happen, understanding how those events might impact perspectives around how they see the nation, how satisfied they are with the candidates. And of course, this has been a topsy-turvy election season. It's been really interesting to see how public opinion has shifted or changed on some things here and there, and also where it hasn't. But understanding the issues that are important to the public and also what the public is thinking about many different things is one of the things I think pre-election polling can also help us with, is to understand the landscape of voters.
Yeah, I just want to add that while we want to minimize bias or minimize systematic error, we're never going to completely eliminate all error in a survey. A survey is a sample. It's going to have sampling error. It's going to have other errors involved with non-response. And just because two polls are different by a point or two doesn't mean they're wrong. It means they are a sample of the same population, and whatever sampling techniques we use are still going to be within a point or two or three margin of error, regardless of how well conducted the polls are. So anyone who's consuming public polls at this point should consume them with the knowledge that a 1 or 2 or 3 point difference is well within the sampling error of any survey.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges, isn't it? That and Ashley and I have actually written about this this process where we call it the 4P process. You've got the pollsters, the politicians, the press, and the public, and we're caught in this 4P dynamic. And as much as our friends in the press try to explain the point that Joe was just making, and to explain margin of error, to explain error, and to explain really that 1 point, 2 points is not it's not a score of a baseball game. But sometimes the consumer of polls feels as though a 1, 2, or 3 point difference is predictive of the outcome of an election that's going to happen in the future. So again, the consumer of polls can be well served by looking at a number of polls, but also I think, and to Mark's point, looking at the insights that you get on issues, looking at the insights that you get on crosstabs. Most high quality polls will publish a full set of cross-tabulations, every question, the exact wording of the question, and allow folks who want to consume the polls to take a look at, really some quite rich data. I mean, one thing, for example, that I think almost everyone does is simple questions about, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of the candidates? We have found, for example, for a while we were all consumed with this new word, the double haters in this cycle, because at the time that it was Biden versus Trump, we found that a particularly large group of people had an unfavorable opinion of both the candidate. That group has shrunk, but now we still even look at these folks we call the love haters. I have a favorable opinion of one, an unfavorable opinion of the other. Of those people who are love haters, they like one, they don't like the other, they're voting for the candidate they like at about the rate of 95%. So you can get insight into the dynamics of the race from questions other than simply the horse race, whether it's the favorabilities, whether it's the issues. It could be forced choice questions. Are you better off or worse off today than you were before? Who do you think is going to help or hurt people like you if they get elected? So it's, I think, beneficial to look at more than just the horse race when you're going through any of the high quality reputable polls.
Yeah, to expand upon that, we have a great question in the Q&A regarding margin of error. Can we all expand on the margin of error and kind of what poll consumers should be looking for when it comes to the margin of error, how we should be interpreting it, how we should be applying it, especially when we're talking about the head-to-head?
I can take a first stab at it. Of course, anybody else wants to jump in, that'd be great. So the margin of error is meant to give us some sense of the uncertainty around a particular point estimate or for an estimate for support for a particular candidate. So we would say that a survey has a margin of error plus or minus 2 or 3 percentage points. As you have less precision in the survey, your margin of errors will get larger. And so for some of the subgroups that I might be interested in, like for example, Asian Americans, while the overall survey may have a margin of error of say plus or minus 2 percentage points, because the sample size of Asian Americans is smaller and the way the survey has been designed, there's some imprecision in getting the sample of Asian Americans that's representative. You might have a margin of error that's more like plus or minus 12 percentage points. So even if among Asian Americans, Harris may be leading Trump by say 11 points, that is what we would say within the margin of error, because the margin of error for Asian Americans is 12 percentage points. And so you should interpret with caution whether or not that is truly a real advantage for Harris, or if it's really just it's a result of the statistical imprecision of the survey. I'd encourage any reader of polls to always look for the margin of error and to be sure that they're thinking about it as percentage points and not necessarily percents, which is something I notice that many journalists might make the mistake in, and most folks don't think in terms of percentage points. But that's how I would describe margin of error. It's one of the key indicators that you need to look at when you're interpreting a survey.
Yeah, and one of the biggest issues in the current political environment is we've had so many national races that have been decided by a couple of points, either in the national popular vote or more critically by a couple of points in the critical swing states in the Electoral College. And that's no exception this year. I mean, the states that Don was talking about, the states that he's polling right now, more than likely are going to be decided by 2 or 3 points or less in November. And no matter how precise the poll is, that's well within the margin of error of any survey of 600 or 1,000 or even 2,000 voters in a state. So we're being asked as pollsters to provide estimates with precision because these races are so close. But no matter how you sample these states, the margin of error in many of these cases is going to be larger than the actual margin of victory in many of these states.
And that's such an important point to make. I think it's really key in thinking about this, Joe. I hadn't thought about it this way, but that we're being asked to provide more precision in an environment where things are really, really close. And that's really, I think, I don't want to say stretching, but certainly pushing us in terms of what we can say or not with regard to predictions.
So, gentlemen, we have some APORites in the audience here, for sure. For those of you who don't know, APOR is the national organization representing the survey research and public opinion research industry. And so, hi, Tom Gutterbach. So Tom asks, what do APOR response rates look like for Siena's polls nowadays? And what % of interviewers are college students? And do you find that helps?
We have a relatively small percentage of college students working as our interviewers now. Probably 25% of our interviewers are college students. We have branched out, and we now have callers actually working for us in as many as 30 states. The college students, in many cases, make excellent interviewers. And it is certainly at Siena, as well as we use academic call centers at a couple of other different universities. It's been a wonderful job for these college students, and they have done quite well. There's always the problem that some of the college students have in terms of handling the rejection that goes with being a call center interviewer. Unfortunately, in the world in which we live, it's not uncommon for someone to receive a phone call and to be a little bit abrasive, we'll say, to the interviewer who has called them up. In terms of response rates, in terms of the APOR calculator, we're probably in the neighborhood of 1.5%. We tend to look at it a little bit differently. Because we recognize that a vast percentage of the calls that we make simply go unanswered, go directly to voicemail. That is in part why we continue to engage in the level of callbacks that we do. And then a lot of people won't do it because they are not highly productive. The first time through the sample is always the most productive. But we will, in fact, in some places, we will be calling people back as many as 10 times if we have field dates that are long enough.
This is one place where I get to crow a little bit about the in-person exit poll. We still, in-person exit polling, have a response rate of over 40%. So that means of people exiting the polling place and being asked to participate by our interviewer, over 40% still agree to participate. In the other modes we're using to get early voters and by-mail voters, we're getting similar response rates that Don's getting. The telephone portion, 1.5%, the email and text to web, similar 1 or 2% response rates. But we do all those modes to try to increase the chances that we contact someone by any of those modes as possible. But at least on election day, voters are still 40% likely to participate in our surveys.
So Joe, Scott Keeter has a follow-up for you. Hi, Scott. We also like to claim Scott from a little bit of Rutgers background as well. So always awesome to affiliate Scott with Rutgers when we can. So Joe, exit polling has been fighting these biases since at least 2004, with supporters of Democrats more willing to cooperate. What has the NEP been doing to deal with this? Can you expand a little bit upon that?
Yeah, we've been evolving the methods and the weighting for the exit poll for the last 20 years. There's a few things we've done. One, in terms of response rate, we know visually our interviewers can record how many men and women refuse to participate, how many young people and old people refuse to participate in our surveys, how many Blacks and non-Blacks refuse to participate. And we've been adjusting for years for non-response based on age, race, and gender. What we've also done is we've realized through experimentation that higher educated voters are more likely to participate in our exit poll than less educated voters. And we've been making adjustments for that as well. And as education has become more correlated with partisan voting patterns, that tends to help mitigate some of these partisan differences. It doesn't do everything. I mean, it's not like we can identify a Republican or a Democrat as they exit the polling place and know the response rates by party, but we do know the response rates by age, by race, by gender. We have historical estimates of response rates by education, and we adjust for that. One of the things we did during the COVID year in 2020, when we were trying to make sure we could maintain the future of exit polling in a COVID environment where people would be willing to participate, we did a bunch of experiments in terms of how to make responding to the exit poll more attractive. And one of the things we did is we placed tables with flag tablecloths where we placed the questionnaires and asked voters to pick up the questionnaires as we did that. And we found that those flags, tablecloths, flags, pens that people used kind of mitigated some of the partisan differences and made people think it was kind of a patriotic duty to participate in the exit poll. And that seems to have helped our estimates as well.
I love that experiment. We have a number of polling and academic celebrities in the audience tonight. Sue Carroll, hi Sue, our own women in politics pioneer and another mentor of mine and near and dear to Eagleton's heart. Sue asks, it looks like younger voters are going to be more mobilized to vote in 2024 than they were in 2020, and they skew heavily Democratic. How are you adjusting your samples to take the possibility of this greater mobilization into account? Are we adjusting samples? How are we considering younger voters?
Well, certainly in this cycle, we initially saw the double haters that we were discussing a little bit earlier to be have an overrepresentation of young people within that group. So there's been a change in that group since Biden has left the race and Harris has entered the race. We certainly are reaching out to young voters very aggressively. We are now making probably about 95% of the calls that we make are via cell phone. We're calling new voters at a very high rate, but it's a group that we worry about having full representation of. Certainly, some of our colleagues who have used a text-to-web strategy feel as though that's been preferable in reaching young people. But still, it's a group that we quota by, and we have found that we have been successful enough to not have to end up waiting the young people that we do get and sample up, but that we, through continued hard work, we're able to identify, find them. And they are, of late, a highly participatory group. In fact, we have found respondents to be more responsive, more enthusiastic over the past 6 weeks to our polling than we had certainly over the spring and even in the last cycle.
Mark, we have a question for you regarding Latino voting patterns, particularly in Texas, but we can even expand it to the rest of the country. Can we expect potentially greater election day turnout by this group? Do we think if there's greater participation, do we think a certain candidate will benefit? Kind of where is the lay of the land right now, 6 weeks out with this key voting bloc?
Yeah, it's a really great question because the Latino population is also a moving target in the sense that the population is growing rapidly. To give you some sense of this, back in 2020, there were 32 million Latinos who were at least 18 years of age and a US citizen. In other words, potential voters or eligible voters. Today, that number is 36.2 million. So there's 4 million more Latinos who become eligible to vote just over the last 4 years. So no doubt we're going to have, even if the voter turnout rate doesn't change, we're going to have a record turnout of Latino voters just because there are more Latinos who can vote. How will that impact the candidates? I think it remains to be seen. I'm not sure if this will have any one impact one way or the other. Yes, the Latino electorate is younger than you see for other groups of US voters. Also, the Latino population is located in many states where Democrats have had significant advantages, like California and New York among Latinos. But notably, since 2016 and 2020, we've seen some subtle shifts across the country in Latinos leaning more towards the Republican Party, or in this case, Donald Trump, in the recent presidential election cycles. So I don't know exactly how this will turn out. We'll have to see where things go. But more than likely, we'll have a record turnout of Latinos just because the demographics are there helping to get us there. Will it be more on top of that because of outreach and so forth? I think, again, that remains to be seen.
Also, we talked a little bit about this previously in terms of what pollsters have tried to improve upon between 2016 and 2020, if anyone wants to expand more upon that, but also kind of what are the challenges we are still facing as an industry?
Well, I think overall, the biggest challenge is trust, and having voters trust or consumers trust our results, and also having respondents trust participating in the survey. We've seen a decrease in trust for all sorts of organizations in this country, whether it's government, political parties, the news media, organized religion, the Supreme Court. You go through the trust measures for all these organizations, and they are way down over the last few decades. And I think our industry, the polling industry, has similar challenges in terms of making sure the people that we talk to, the people that we interview, trust the process. That's been our handshake agreement with respondents for decades, that they trust us to ask honest questions, to have them have their views be recorded accurately and anonymously and privately to us, and that we share those results to the public in an honest fashion. And we have to continue to build that trust, especially in an environment where trust is decreasing for all organizations.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about response rate, and this kind of goes hand in hand. Any comments on refusal rates? Don, specifically, there was a question for you for the New York Times Siena poll. What is your refusal rate approximately?
Well, that's not really a number that we compute. I'll give you like a more on the ground rate. So an average interviewer that is working for us in an hour will dial the phone about 60 times. Of those 60 times that they dial the phone, they'll get in the neighborhood of 12 to 15 people who say hello. Of those 12 to 15 hellos, they will complete less than one interview per hour. So, those are the averages. I think that what we find is that it's really quite ironic in some ways that it's very common for respondents when they make it through the interview to say something to the interviewer like, I wasn't going to do this, but it was really enjoyable. I appreciate you calling. I appreciate the way this went. We at the end of our interviews will ask respondents whether they'd be willing to participate in a follow-up. We in effect harvest them for additional research. And the rate of at which people agree to be contacted again of those who completed the interviews is very high. We've seen it in some cases to be approaching 50%. So it's somewhat ironic, somewhat frustrating, that try it, you'll like it, but to get people, as Joe I think was pointing out, to try it is quite challenging. At this point, given the manner in which we conduct the interviews, we remain confident that the group of people who end up participating in the interview is representative of all people, and that they're, so long as we protect against what we call the anti-establishment non-response bias, that we have a representative sample. We try through our quota system to not have to weight our sample very much. It's something we haven't talked about, the design effect of weighting. We strive to keep the amount that we have to weight our final sample as low as we possibly can. But yeah, many people simply don't pick up the phone. Many people, as soon as it's a voice that they're unfamiliar with, they terminate the call within the first couple of seconds. So once we get by the hi, this is Don calling from, we do quite well.
Definitely. I love this question that I'm about to say, and I may even just answer it myself. Are young people going into polling? What in general is the state of the field of practice? Claude, I used to be young and I went into polling, and now I am middle-aged. But all of the faces you see on the screen have incredible internship and work opportunities, and young people are certainly going into polling if you're talking about it as a career path. Don, Joe, Mark, I don't know if you have any few words for aspiring young pollsters.
Yes, there are plenty of opportunities in Washington and across the country to pursue a career in polling. And I'd encourage a lot of folks who are interested in understanding what the nation thinks, what the public thinks, to really consider a career in polling. But I would also say that I think we also face some challenges. I think we face some challenges as a profession in terms of diversity. And diversity not just along race and ethnicity lines, but also I think diversity along even political party or political point of view lines. And I'd say gender as well. I think it seems that fewer men are entering the field than women, and it's quite lopsided, in fact, in many ways. But racial and ethnic diversity, I think, has been one of the challenges of our profession, and I hope it's something that all of us continue to pay attention to as we seek to find interns and offer opportunities to newly minted BAs and PhDs. I hope that we can find some of those wonderful folks who might be interested, who are of different groups by race and ethnicity.
That was beautiful, Mark. We have so many questions in the chat. I really appreciate all of your questions. Unfortunately, we have a couple more minutes left in the night. And I wanted to get to two very important things. What should we be on the lookout for in these next 6 weeks until Election Day when it comes to the polls? And what should consumers of polls be mindful of? What are polls used for? What should they be and shouldn't be used for? Kind of what are our closing thoughts?
Well, I think that there's going to be a great number of polls that will be published publicly between here and Election Day. And I think that from the consumer standpoint, it's a bounty. And so I think that Natalie's comments, I would certainly recommend go to the aggregation sites and get a wide angle view of the election from the benefit of multiple polls. Certainly, you also have the benefit. You take a poll like ours or other large scale operations. You can not only go to the aggregation sites, but you can look at our poll over time. To what degree have our numbers been consistent or changed in order to try to pick up on trends, whether it be within states, whether it be within demographic groups. That certainly is highly edifying to look at trends within a single poll as well as the aggregation sites. To look out for everybody, every journalist, every analyst, every political candidate has an angle, and it won't be uncommon for them to seize upon a single finding, a single poll, to try to make a point which may not be justified. So you've got to, step back sometimes and say, is the conclusion that someone is drawing from a certain poll justified? So it's going to take a little time on the part of a consumer to fully appreciate the insights that are available from polls, but go to the aggregation sites and/or track a single poll, the trend lines within that poll over time.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate that in a close election, small differences in polls might not mean a hell of a lot when it comes to the actual outcome. I see people with vicious Twitter arguments over a poll that shows a candidate up by 1 point in the state, and another poll that shows the other candidate up by 2 points in the state, and they're all within the margin of error, and yet there's these vicious Twitter wars over what those differences represent. So I think if you look at the battleground polls in the 7 states that we all expect to decide the Electoral College, if those margins are 3 points or less, then those states are still going to be up for grabs when it comes to Election Day, and I wouldn't put too much stock in 1 or 2 point movements. I mean, the one big movement that we have seen in the polls over the last few months is the incredible increase in the favorable rating of Kamala Harris from before Joe Biden dropped out, when her numbers seemed anchored with his in the low to mid 30s, to the point now where her favorable numbers are in the high to mid 40s. I mean, in many of these polls, she had a 10, 12 point increase in favorable rating over the last few months. That's in this atmosphere of races that are that close. That was a dramatic movement, and the polls picked that up. And that's a real movement. But a lot of times people are fighting over 1 or 2 point movements that may not be reflective of any real change in attitudes.
And actually, I'd just say quickly that one of the things I wanted to draw on here that both Don and Joe have said is the importance of looking at all of these polls and not any one single one. So it's going to seem kind of breathless as we go over the course of the next couple of weeks. There's going to be a lot of coverage about this poll says that, and the next day it'll be that poll said that. I'd say take the long view, step back and look and see what does the pattern look like. One doesn't necessarily always need to rely on an aggregator for this. Just look and see. And does it say, what are you seeing? Are there changes emerging? Are these all within the margin of error? That I think will tell you a lot. And as a consumer, that's one of the easiest things I think you can do is try to stand back and take that long view.
Thank you so much. A huge thank you to Mark, Don, and Joe. All of your insight were incredibly invaluable. And thank you to all of you for staying with us tonight. Be sure to keep following the work of all 3 of these gentlemen as we approach Election Day in the next 6 weeks. Thank you so much.